The recording. Great. All right. Well, good morning. Welcome, Maggie Walker Governor's School. We are really excited to see you in the top 12 of this year's national competition. My name's Emily Voss. I will be your facilitator and timekeeper. You all know me pretty well as the Virginia State Coordinator for We the People. So in just a moment, I'm going to hand things over to your judges. They'll introduce themselves and ask you to do the same, and then they'll proceed with the question, your response, and the follow-ups. So certainly looking forward to your presentation today, and the judges are looking forward to having a great conversation with you. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and mute and hand things over to the judges.
Thank you, Emily. Well, welcome, Virginia. My name is Tim Moore. I'm at the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin. And my colleagues are?
I'm Sue Leeson, Senior Justice, Oregon Supreme Court.
I'm Miriam Mimar-Sadeghi. I was a participant in We the People and I serve on the board of the Center for Civic Education and have been providing civic education to people in the Middle East. I'm originally from Iran.
And you are?
Hello, we are Unit 1 from the Maggie L. Walker Governor's School in Richmond, Virginia. My name is Connor Diaz, and we'd like to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to judge us.
My name is Varun Mondegi.
My name is Nate Bampton, and this is our sponsor, Mr. Almschneider.
Good morning, Sam. Well, we're going to do question number 1 in Unit 1. Quote, the American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution, end quote. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making in the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? To what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times? You may begin.
There was no clear singular motivation for the American Revolution. Historians and even colonists themselves disagree about the driving factors and significance of different ideas. However, some crucial revolutionary principles and understandings were Republican equality and the fear of conspiracy to destroy liberty.
According to Gordon Wood, the Whig's conception of equality was a quintessential principle of the American Revolution. Gordon Wood wrote, quote, it was widely believed that equality of opportunity would necessarily result in rough equality of station, end quote, and it would follow that everyone would be content knowing that they are responsible for the outcome of their life. In pursuit of this, every state constitution prohibited titles of nobility, denying anyone a permanent artificial boost.
Another prominent idea in the Revolution was a strong fear of conspiracy against liberty. John Dickinson questioned, ought not the people therefore to watch, to observe facts, to search into causes? With an Enlightenment emphasis on causes, the Americans saw the end of benign neglect and the following acts as the British scheming to take American freedom. In the same vein, the Pennsylvania 1776 Constitution attempts to make sure the government can never execute conspiratorial designs. Section 15 requires that laws be attached with purposes in the preamble, and that before they can be passed, they must be put before the people to vote on. It observes the government with a microscope and denies any trust to the intentions and actions of the government, fearful of a possible government conspiring to harm its own people.
The Lockean conception of consent doesn't pose any significant problems to the creation or amendment of constitutions. Though Locke asserts that consent is, quote, the beginning of political societies, his conception of what exactly constitutes consent is somewhat nebulous. For Locke, consent is either provided through, quote, positive engagement or, quote, express promise and compact. This malleable definition makes it easy for constitutional framers to work around any problems of consent.
One of his letters to Madison, Jefferson breaks from the Lockean view, reasoning that, quote, the earth belongs in usufruct to the living, end quote. By this, Jefferson means that the consent afforded to a constitution by some long-dead founding generation can't be conflated with the consent of a living one, and thus that constitutions need generational reaffirmation. Jefferson shows that Locke's conception of implicit consent can be overexpanded to create consent where really there is none.
The problem of implicit consent is particularly clear in the territories, like Puerto Rico, where, according to the Insular Areas Report, fundamental rights apply as a matter of law, but other constitutional rights are not available. Puerto Rican citizens cannot consent to constitutional change or even legitimate governance because they are denied representation.
Consent also proves problematic when constitutional change is pursued too quickly or without popular election playing a role. For example, the rapid passing of the 18th Amendment prevented the American people from adequately consenting to the amendment before it was ratified.
Revolutionary principles have also evolved over time. The expansion of suffrage through the 13th, 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments cemented voting's role in articulating popular consent, yet voter turnout remains incredibly low, with only 53.6% of people eligible to vote turning out for the 2016 general election. This is troubling if we want revolutionary principles like popular consent and civic virtue to remain important values.
Politicians like Senator Bernie Sanders have transformed and reinvigorated the revolutionary principle of equality. His skepticism about wealth inequality contrasts the founding generation's ideal meritocracy as described by Gordon Wood. Sanders criticizes this Whig revolutionary conception of equality in favor of a more robust system of wealth redistribution through taxation, regulation, and government programs.
Many American politicians share the founders' fear of conspiracy to undermine liberty. Ronald Reagan, in particular, saw his conspiracy in the federal bureaucracy and sought to devolve bureaucratic power to local and state governments. The revolutionary principles from which he drew his ideas can be seen in his 1964 Time for Choosing speech, when he said, quote, "Either we accept the responsibility for our own destiny, or we abandon the American Revolution and confess that an intellectual belief in a far distant capital can plan our lives better for us than we can plan them ourselves." Reagan slashed budgets and used Article II appointment powers to allow people like EPA Administrator Ann Gorsuch to limit federal power. Although Reagan's ideology greatly contrasts that of Sanders, both politicians draw from revolutionary principles, which still animate politics today.
Okay. You spoke about the need for regular reaffirmation of constitutional principles. And in the beginning, you spoke about equality and liberty. We have had protests in America over George Floyd and the issues of race in general. Do you feel that those acts of civil disobedience are part of the giving consent to government? And what about when they are not nonviolent, when they're not civil?
I think in response to your question about the peaceful protests against police violence as part of the Black Lives Matter protest over the past year, I think that they are less givings of consent, but more better understood as revolutions in and of themselves, especially in the Lockean conception of what exactly constitutes a revolution. For Locke, a revolution is simply a time wherein a regime is created or amended to restore the natural order to the people. This includes ensuring that these people are guaranteed their natural rights. Thus, legislation passed in response to the George Floyd protests, which guarantee more effectively the right to life to African American people who are so often prejudiced by police officers, is in and of itself a Lockean revolution.
I strongly disagree with my colleague Connor. I think if we look at Locke's theory to revolution and what the BLM protests are attempting, they do not mix at all. The BLM protests are not seeking to overthrow the government, nor are they seeking to create their own state. They're not seeking to, quote unquote, return to the state of nature, to reestablish their own governance. Moreover, I would like to address Miriam's question, or Judge Miriam's question, and say that violence, or it is perfectly acceptable to do. These are, in fact, demonstrations of consent. If we look back to what the founders did, they themselves participated in violent riots and what they saw as protestations of English rule. The most famous is the Boston Tea Party, where they dumped tea into the harbor, but they also tarred and feathered stamp collectors. And in Massachusetts, they, I think, burned down the governor's house and burned down the stamp collector's house in acts of protest. So even violence is acceptable.
Okay.
In his quotation, or as part of his speech, Benjamin Rush argued that this new form of government that the revolution is trying to effect is going to require not only principles, and you've identified two, but morals and manners for citizens if it's going to be successful. What kind of morals and manners are required to achieve conformance to the principles that you have identified? And have we done so?
Founders like John Adams definitely would have argued in favor of a Christian moral education as a means by which we might cultivate civic virtue among citizens. Civically virtuous citizens would be best equipped to uphold both the principle of equality and best equipped to understand when their government is conspiring to destroy their liberty.
Simultaneously, however, other founders like Thomas Jefferson vehemently disagreed with this, and this can be seen in his passage of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom and also the Declaration of Rights that George Mason published in Virginia. These two pieces of legislation really declared that there was disagreement among the founders about how best to cultivate what Jefferson called a natural aristoi as opposed to a pseudo-aristoi given by artificial titles of nobility.
Specifically, Jefferson wanted to create a school system that he talks about in his letters of just as I said, creating a school system to develop the education of people.
And that education would emphasize political participation as the main virtue, as opposed to the more Christian values and virtues that John Adams wanted when he tried to impose sumptuary laws in Massachusetts.
What kind of manners are required among Americans if we're going to affect or complete this revolution?
This is where I might disagree with my colleague's earlier statement about violence being permissible, because I think that one of the most important things within a civil society is that we engage in deliberation and we have the manners to listen and actively adhere to what political opponents may say. So Robbie P. George carefully articulates this as one of the foundations of truth-seeking in democracy, where we substantively want to be wrong, in other words, correct our failures as people.
I think I disagree with my colleague, but I think a stronger or important manner is an idea of patriotism or an idea of strong bonding as a nation. We see following the Articles of Confederation that people knew it was failing and they were going to, well, at the time they knew to create it or they were going to reform it, but it was never considered, never, that they would abolish the United States. That was always assumed to be true. It just never comes up. I mean, it's threatened, but that exception proves the rule that they wanted to stay together. And so I think the manner of the revolution is a sense of nationalism and patriotism.
I think another important manner, and perhaps this is just a little bit more pervasive and can be considered a value, is civic virtue. And by civic virtue, I mean one's willingness to subjugate their own interests and their own wants in the name of the common good, even if that common good doesn't directly benefit them.
Well, we could pursue that for a long time, but I want to get Tim for his question.
Definitely. I'd like to ask a little bit about the anti-federalist, picking up on your theme of this fear there's a conspiracy against liberty. Could you give me some insight as to what the anti-federalist argument was in this vein, this conspiracy against liberty?
So I think if we especially look to Brutus I, we can kind of see that they saw the new federal government as somewhat of a parallel to the British government. One of the arguments was that it was a far distant capital that would have the sole power of essentially raising an army and have no checks, because at the time, the Second Amendment hadn't been established to guarantee militias for the several states. Additionally, if we look at the language, it talks about how his uncontrollable power to, specifically through the elastic clause from Article 1, Section 8, and it was this overwhelming fear that there would be no checks to the government, that it wasn't controllable, and partly because it was too far away and it had sole power.
I think, however, if we were to look at Madison's vices of the political system, we can see that there is an inherent hypocrisy in anti-federalist arguments, because we are seeing conspiracies between the states, specifically when we look to the way that Maryland and Pennsylvania, and I think Virginia also, ganged up on other states to impose trade laws. And we also saw conspiracies with Georgia and Native Americans. We can see that there were conspiracies that were less regulated than the ones that we have under the federal Constitution, which prohibits interstate compacts under the Article 4 of the Constitution, and also make sure that whatever interstate compacts exist are within the public view.
Thank you.
Mariam next. If she doesn't have a question, I sure do. I want to go back to this discussion.
I do. I was muted.
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
Stu. So
Oh,
my
sorry.
apologies. I was muted. When you look at your own country today and your own role in it, what do you find is most in need of expressing consent over? And how do you draw inspiration from everything that you've been reading and thinking about? Let me phrase it another way. Where do you see the lack of consent and how do you want to address it?
I think the lack of consent is most evident in the fact that it is very difficult to withdraw consent from our political system. John Locke thought that people could withdraw their consent by simply moving to a place that was uninhabited and perhaps establishing their own government. However, today, most habitable land on the face of the earth is governed by one country or another. Therefore, and if we consider the difficulty that comes along with people moving to simply another country, we realize that it's very hard for someone to withdraw their consent from the government. I think that one way we could remedy this is by making it easier to move between states. If one state passes a law that I don't consent to, I could perhaps move to another state. However, this becomes more difficult when we consider how the federal government has expanded the breadth of its legislative powers by using the elastic clause in Article 1, Section 8.
I would also like to take the time to explain some of the things that my colleague said, because Section 115 is where John Locke writes in the second treatise about this freedom to move where there is room enough to create new societies, and that's simply not possible in the modern world. And also the ability to move between states is a major way of demonstrating also political speech. If we look to Sands v. Rio, which is a case deciding whether we can get certain benefits based on moving states and whether those benefits stay the same, we can see that they looked back to the Articles of Confederation in Article 4, where the right to ingress and regress was allowing people to move states freely. And this is something that's very important that builds on what my colleague was saying, because the federal Constitution and the Articles of Confederation were unable to overcome these class barriers to that.
Give me an example of how the federal government has made it harder for me to move to another state. That goes right over my head.
I wouldn't say that it's the federal government's decision on that, but it's actually just the nature of.
I thought that's what Connor said.
I did not mean to say that the federal government has made it harder for me to move between states, but rather that it is difficult to move between states.
Why?
The general wealth required in order to purchase a home and live substantively in a new state is something that simply poor Americans don't have access to, specifically because they live wage to wage. They don't have.
Okay, no, I get that. So when you say make it easier for people to move state to state, how do you do that? That's a public policy. Help me.
Time.
Bernie Sanders, I guess.
Would one word be sufficient? I would say transportation access, but other two words.
Or regulation of real estate price between states. But
Thank you.
Nate counted the words. Nate counted the words. That was 2. Okay.
I guess I'll start with the feedback. I think it's interesting that you wanted to narrow down the nature, the primary motivations to the revolution to a principle of equality and this Whig distrust of power. I think that's although I might suggest there's a few other categories too, but I appreciate the fact that you identified 2 guiding North Stars for your presentation, and the presentation was well structured around that. And what's a day without reference to Jefferson's usufruct? I mean, so, but it's a good point that he's a lot more flexible with constitution making and consent issues. On the idea of civil disobedience and how far you want to go, we're dabbling on the edge of January 6th here, and so I on the one hand I commend you for going out there on that limb. It's a hard question, how far to go, and was January 6th an exercise of legitimate consent or withdrawal? We'll leave that to the historians to decide. But I appreciate the fact that you're willing to go out on that limb and take that risk. I would have liked to heard a little bit more about somebody other than Brutus on this idea of there's a conspiracy afoot. As you probably well know, there's a ton of anti-federalist rhetoric and maybe hyperbole about the Constitution during the ratification debates. But on the whole, this is a very strong presentation, and I've enjoyed our time together.
thank you, Judge.
Thank you.
I enjoyed, as I mentioned yesterday, I don't know if it was, I saw you guys yesterday or the day before. I think it was yesterday. I really always enjoy hearing from Maggie Walker School, and you guys are a great team. You work well together. I like how you disagree with each other. You probably know this, the judges for this competition come from a sort of a diversity of backgrounds, and I'm definitely not as well versed as the other 2 judges here on the scholarship, but I do really tune in to see how well people can make an argument that is genuine. And it seemed like you guys had spent at least a year, really thinking, not just learning, but thinking what it means for you. And I think that is the difference between, exemplary, the outstanding teams, and the rest, because it's not just about the knowledge. I mean, the reason we do all this is because it matters for the nation. It matters for the freedom, for the equality, for us as a polity, as one country, and to be able to sustain our institutions and our freedoms. And I see you guys in a very genuine way engaging with the material and feeling passionate and proud about it. Congrats again to your teacher too.
Thank you.
Judge.
I agree. Very nice job. Particularly appreciated our conversation afterwards. Your ability to respond to our questions was impressive. I agree with Tim that I think you cabined yourself maybe a little too much by focusing on conspiracy and equality as the two principles. When we got to the end, you're basically acknowledging that the various unequal distribution of property is a problem with respect to consent and withdrawing consent. Now you've walked right into Federalist 10, but you skipped over it in your presentation, and that surprised me a little bit. I also needed to hear more about, you're throwing in a classical Republican concept of civic virtue that I don't see necessarily associated with the revolutionary principles contained in our founding. If they're there, I need you to develop them more, because Locke, I don't read Locke as really containing any notion of civic virtue. We have to look more to the notion of self-interest rightly understood to build a principle that doesn't seem to be there. So I would urge you to think about adding some additional principles, but my goodness, that was a great presentation. I really hate to have to leave. So thanks a million.
Thank you.
Judge.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for